Black Man of the Nile and His Family, Part 9. The following chronological dates and events have been detailed from the above outline of the various periods of Nile Valley high culture, especially those of Timeri, Tahaniesi, Meroe, and Libya, Ethiopia, Punt, and others along the entire length of the Blue and White Nile, the Abara, and the Great Lakes region of ʻjoʊkənən. The Great Lakes and Nile Valleys map before the extended chronology allows the student to be able to make cross-references with respect to the modern and ancient boundaries of the Nile Valley high cultures. The following chronology is exactly the same as it appears in the first edition. There have been very few technological changes. The author found it necessary to combine various aspects of all of the chronologies dealing with the indigenous African peoples of the Nile and Great Lake regions to show the commonality of high cultures they developed from the beginning of their migrations to the north: Ta-Nehisi, Timeri, Ethiopia, Punt, Libya, Hatta, Carthagena, Meroe, Media, etc. It would be noticed that there are many periods in the above chronology for which no coverage of the particular viceroy or monarch is given. Such periods are marked by the confusing lack of information for anyone to draw a definite conclusion as to just where the boundaries of either these countries actually began or ended. There were many periods in which overlapping reign existed, to the extent that the cultures of the Nile Valley and the Great Lakes regions appear to be the co-equal of other indigenous cultures all over the continent of ʻjoʊkənən. Because of the above cross-references, one can better understand why it is impossible for the Africans of Ta-Nehisi and Timeri to have developed completely separate high cultures that had no common origin. However, the following chronologies deal with the overlapping pharaohs, monarchs, and countries. Dealing with Timeri, Tahaniesi, Meroe, Ethiopia, Kush, and Punt as if they were distinctly separate nations of the Nile Valley at any time during the first four dynasties, 3200 through 2565 BCE, is completely erroneous. This must be taken into consideration even though European American educators who have established themselves as a sole authority on all of the Nile Valley cultures in their own racist interpretation of this area of ʻjoʊkənən history, which developed from the early half of the 19th century CE, purposely ignore this fact. Most of them have attributed this aspect of their folly to the misinterpretation of the inscription of the so-called Palermo stone by the late Professor James Henry Breasted, founder of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, Illinois. Yet it is this professor's version of said document that most modern white liberal Africanists use for this aspect of Tahanesian and Timerian history. The same Professor Breasted, the United States of America's first recognized authority on Egypt, was the noted academician who wrote the following scholarly comments about the superiority of the great white race in his book, The Conquest of Civilization, pages 112 through 113. The population of the great northwest quadrant from the Stone Age onward has been a race of white men of varying physical type. The evolution of civilization has been the achievement of the great white race. In the territory adjoining the northwest quadrant, there are only two other clearly differentiated races, the Mongoloid and the Negroid. On the east of the northwestern quadrant, the secluded plateaus of High Asia developed a type of man with straight and weary-haired, round-haired, almost beardless face and yellow skin, a man whom we call Mongoloid. The migrations of these yellow men out of the High Asia eventually diffused therein in all directions, but they did not reach the northwest quadrant until long civilization was already highly developed. Not did they themselves develop a civilization until long after it was far advanced in the northwest quadrant. On the south of the northwest quadrant lay the teeming black world of Africa, separated from the great white race by an impassable desert barrier, the Sahara, which formed so large of the southern flatlands, isolated, thus at the same time unfitted by ages of tropical life for any effective intrusion among the white race. The Negro and Negroid peoples remained without any influence on the development of early civilization. We may then exclude both of these external races, the straight-haired, round-headed, yellow-skinned Mongoloids on the east, and the woolly-haired, long-headed, dark-skinned Negroids on the south, from any share in the origins or subsequent development of civilization. The great white race itself, which dominated the northwest quadrant, include and always included a considerable range of types, from the fair-headed, long-headed, so-called Nordics of the northern flatland, through the round-headed, alpine or Aminoid peoples of the highland zone in the middle, to the dark-skinned, long-headed Mediterranean race of the southern flatland. To this type belong the Egyptians, also the Semites, and of course the great bulk of the population of Greece, Italy, and Spain, long loosely called Aryan because of their speech, which of course has no necessary connection with race. How could Professor Breasted, himself a full-fledged member of the great white race, and thinking as he did in the above, honestly see the commonality between Mediterranean race of Egypt and his Negro and Negroid people of Nubia, who remained without any influence of the development of early civilization? This projected and paraphrased citation of Professor Breasted's racism is best observed in the underlying sentences above. Breasted's contempt for his Negroid and Negroid's people even made him forget to capitalize the word Negro as he did the word white. Of course, Breasted's citation is an example of the type of orthodox academic authority and scholarship African American, and African Caribbean writers and professors are expected to endorse in their own works dealing with the history and high culture of the indigenous African, their own ancestors, of the Nile valleys and Great Lake regions, not to mention the others of the entire northern limits above the Sahara. But let it be not mistaken, Professor Breasted's declaration is still the God-inspired holy words with respect to Akubalan, particularly Ta-Mary and Ta-Hanisi, so far as the modern white liberal Africanists who teach and write for African and Black studies departments throughout the academic communities. Leaving Breasted's Negrophobia for a while, it must be stated quite emphatically that it is the inscription of a stone fragment from Heracleopolis dealing with a battle that was fought between the military forces of Pharaoh Qasim Kemufi and Ta-Mary and Pharaoh Djer of Ta-Nehisi, whose name is not mentioned in most of the works related to this story, they have proclaimed was a conflict between the Semitic Egyptians and their less civilized Negro Nubian neighbors to the south, both allegedly being of two distinctly different races. At least this is what Orthodox and liberal Africanists would have us to believe. From the two inscriptions mentioned above, the white liberal Africanist authorities have established their hypotheses that south of the First Cataract, from at least during the Second Dynasty, 2800 through 2780 BCE, Egypt and Nubia were two distinctly separate nations racially. The major premise of these allegedly authoritative declarations on the part of Africanists and Egyptologists is that the inscriptions on the Heracleopolis fragment shows the sign Seti over the head of the kneeling pharaoh Kasemui on a prisoner. J. E. Bell and W. F. Green, in their article Hieroglyphs II, an Egyptian research account, London 1902, mentioned the above theory many years before Professor Breasted passed off his own orthodox white racist interpretation of the inscription of the so-called Palermo stone to his fellow European American educators from his citadel at the University of Chicago, Illinois, where he also developed much of the Semitic, Hamitic, and Caucasian North and East African syndrome currently taught by his disciples and others who still control much of the written information related to Africa's history and high culture. Professor Breasted's version of the inscription on the Palermo stone obviously tried to prove the same alleged fact, if such we may call the above remarks, through the hypotheses that Pharaoh Sneferu of the 4th dynasty, 2720 BCE, warred against his fellow indigenous Africans of Ta-Nehisi, the land of the Southerners, extended beyond the First Cataract, and that the withdrawal of the Temerians back to his alleged boundary line created the First Cataract meant that they considered this natural barrier dividing line between their two countries, Temeri and Ta-Nehisi. But the professor failed to mention that Temerians, black, browns, or Egyptians had already established battle lines, not boundary line, beyond their own possibility of supplying them against their own equally powerful Ta-Nehisians, black, browns, or Nubians of this period in the history of both national groupings. Since the professor did not emphasize the fact that the Temerians made it a point to capture 7,000 prisoners and confiscate at least 200,000 cattle and sheep from the Ta-Nehisians during the battle in question, could he not have also overlooked the fact that the main purpose of the battle was economics? The Temerians wanted to plunder and ravage the much more materially prosperous Ta-Nehisians land at the south of Temeri, and not for racial reasons, as he and others before him, not to mention those after him, has continuously implied. Equally, he must have forgotten that the first unifier of what turned out to be dynastic Egypt was a southerner from Nubia named Aha or Narmer, on some inscriptions Mena, Menes. This aspect of the Nile Valley history and high culture began on the first day of the first dynasty, 3200 BCE, according to the chronological calculations of the high priest of Egypt's mystery systems Manetho, at approximately the year 280 BCE, during the so-called 32nd dynasty. But it is not equally a fact that the monarchs and lords of two lands, Nubia and Egypt, also Libya, Meroe, Ethiopia, and Punt, were related in every manner possible, including racially. The usually self-proclaimed European American white Orthodox and liberal Africanist authority on Egypt has carefully forgotten that the vast majority of the pharaohs of Egypt, those who did not come far off Asia and Europe as invaders and conquerors, beginning with the 14th dynasty, 1675 BCE, and after, came from the south, at least from Egypt south, which was very much north of the First Cataract at that period in Nile Valley history and high culture. The Egyptians or Temerians' entire literature, both secular and religious, if separable, is replete with documentary inscriptions relating to their southern origin and even their god. They said came from the source of the Nile, Hapi, the Nile god, at the mountain of the moon. One must remember that the source of Hapi, the Nile River, is still the same place in Central East Africa around Uganda, Kenya, Zaire, or Congo, Tanzania, and other areas around the Great Lakes, at the foot of the Mountain of the Moon, today's Kilimanjaro, in the Kenda-based language called Kiswahili, as recorded in the Book of the Coming of the Fourth by Day, Egyptian Book of the Dead, and Papyrus of Ani, written about 4000 BCE. The other two sources of the Nile are both in the so-called Ethiopian highlands. The Blue Nile, which begins at Lake Tana, and the Atbara River that commences both north of the lake, along with the Nile, all three joins at Abara to form what is called the Nile. What the Orthodox authorities on Africa purposely ignore is that the military expeditions by the Temerians into Tahitian lands were the cause celebrate that created their imagery boundary line around the regions of the First Cataract, which allegedly took place during the Fourth Dynasty, 2268 through 2258 BCE. They have carefully forgotten that Tahiti was in fact the center of Timeri's building materials industry and its supply of professional craftsmen from the beginning of its pre-dynastic existence, which was hundreds of years before the so-called Hyksos Semites from Asia arrived as conquerors in Akubalan in about 1675 BCE, and many hundred years before the white Caucasian, Indo-European, Macedonian Greeks from Europe in 332 BCE. The Macedonian Greek conquerors being referred to were the same people that ravaged and plundered the libraries and other repositories of the indigenous African works in art, science, religion, law, etc. on the orders of General Sotar and Aristotle, who placed his own name on many of the documents he stole from the lodges and temples of the Nile Valley Africans mystery systems at Luxor. Luxor, today called Thebes, was originally located in Ta-Nehisi before the imaginary boundary borderline that allegedly divided Nubia from Egypt was carried southwards through military conquest at a very much later period in the Nile Valley history. For example, all of the Fourth Dynasty, 2723 through 2560 BCE, diorite quarries at the west of Abu Simbel and Tumas produced most of the materials used in the construction of the statues for Timerian royal pyramids and mastabas, including the colossal temple of Abu Simbel, built by Pharaoh Ramses II of the 14th dynasty, 1298 through 1232 BCE, shown on page 184 of this volume. European and European American treasure seekers and archaeologists have unearthed, discovered, or found inscribed, sculptured, and painted stones by the thousands with the name and title of countless pharaohs and other royal members dealing with religious and secular history and other aspects of Nile Valley high cultures, some of them specifically related to pharaohs Khufu and Djedefre on the Second Dynasty, 2680 BCE. Also, Sahur, the second pharaoh of the Fifth Dynasty, 2565 through 2420 BCE. All of them are still waiting to be transported to Timeri. Others have found inscriptions that they were designed for the tomb and temple of Pharaoh Seti and Pepi of the Sixth Dynasty, 2420 through 2258 BCE at Tumas. The following comments, or the chronologies, which began on page 136 of the inter and intra relationships between the high cultures of the Nile Valley's blue and white and Great Lakes region, pinpoint many of the inaccuracies caused by the distortions of countless inscriptions of Al-Kubalan's history we have been and will be examining, and to a great extent they will also expose how the authorities on Africa and African peoples continue perpetuating racism and religious bigotry of an alleged North and East Africa that was and still is Semitic and or Caucasian, but never Negro, Negroid, or Bantu, according to the countless distorted hypotheses they have attributed to the inscriptions. Upon what justifiable basis did the racist conclusions already drawn from the inscriptions on the Palermo stone and the compilers fragments applied to the chronologies. The chronologies previously shown on those to follow, among other graphs, charts, and pictures, certainly indicate that the Ta-Nehisians resisted Tamarian imperial colonialism to the point of defeating the Tamarians on many occasions, forced them out of Ta-Nehisi, and following this became themselves imperial colonizers of Tamaria again and again. These facts are very seldom mentioned by self-appointed authorities on Africa in their Semitic and Caucasian North and East Africa syndrome. It is obvious that whatever is responsible for mankind in ʻAkubulan equally created all sorts of the same physical types of indigenous Africans of Tamari, Ta-Nehisi, Ethiopia, Meroe, and elsewhere throughout the entire Nile Valley and Great Lake regions before the authorities from Europe and European Americans arrived on the scene with their textbooks and hypotheses and moved the frontier of Tamari southwards in order to sustain their Negro-less North and East Africa, where only white and black Caucasians, white Semites, and black or brown Hamites, also an occasional Nilot, occupied before the Negroes were brought there as slaves from Nubia. When the white Orthodox and liberal Africanist authorities accomplished their repopulation of the Nile Valley and North Africa to suit their racist Negrophobia, mentally that is, were they not aware of the two most noted inscriptions dealing with the quarrying activities of Meroe, the last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, 2420 through 2255 BCE, found near the first cataract, which explained that Pharaoh Mariners' armies came from very much further north. The inscriptions dealing with the submission of the Ta-Nehisian minor, princes and lords of Magi, Urtet, and Watwat to Pharaoh's Marner, frequently cited in the most of the authorities' works, did not indicate in any whatsoever that the princes and lords captured south of the first cataract proved that their nation's boundary line with Tamari began at that point, as implied by the late Professor James Henry Breasted and so many others of the so-called authorities on Africa of European, American, and European origin. The military occupation of Ta-Nehisi by the Tamarians of the Middle Kingdom period, 2150 through 1580 BCE, all of whom European and European American white liberal Africanists labeled C group people, was in fact no usual situation as most Egyptologists would like us to believe. This is obvious, as the chronologies have shown that the people of the Lower and Upper Nile Valley, blue and white, were part and parcel of the original unitary high culture, which completely fragmentized itself about the period of the 4th dynasty, 2680 through 2565 BCE. They were from all over the entire, more than 4,100 miles length of the Nile Valley. Their arrival to the lower lands began with the migrations from south-central ʻAkubulan north to the Mediterranean Sea as they traveled with the flow of the Nile. For example, was it not Opi from the south, whom the Greeks renamed Thebans, because they originally came from the city of Thebes, ancient Luxor, that took control of the entire Fayum region, which included Memphis and Heracleopolis, up until the 9th and 10th dynasties, 2100 through 2050 BCE. The fact is that these southerners actually ruled all of the northern Ta-Nehisi and most of the southern Tamari before they finally assumed military and political command over the royal thrones of the entire south and north, the two lands. Their initial campaign control extended in a northern course all the way to Asyut. The second northern drive took them to the southern limits of the delta. The third and final thrust led them all the way across the delta to the seashores of the southern Mediterranean Sea, Tamari's north. These indigenous Africans of the 11th dynasty, 2150 through 2000 BCE were actually the power behind the throne of the 2nd through 11th dynasties, 3200 through 2100 BCE. This fact is specifically cited in the chronologies. Western educators, irrespective of their areas of discipline, could not in the past and cannot now tell themselves this because of the fact that they are fully aware of the origin of the oak is without a doubt the Great Lakes region of the beginning of the Nile River Valley and central Al-Kubalan, which is of course qualified them as Africans south of the Sahara, Negroes and or Bantus. These indigenous Africans, founders of the Luxor dynasty, later Theban dynasty, the 11th dynasty, control is obvious all the way to the upper and south at the first cataract, where there still exist inscriptions relative to Pharaoh Meri Ibn of the 11th dynasty, 2242 through 2200 BCE. One of these inscriptions even referred to the oak control all the way to the lower land north to the city of Heracleopolis near Memphis, the capital of Tamari at this period in the Nile Valley history. In the same set of inscriptions, there are references to Prince Antes, a distant predecessor or of the 11th dynasty, Pharaoh Antes, 2160 through 2150 BCE, expeditions during the first intermediate period, 6th through 10th dynasties, 2258 through 2052 BCE, to secure the Southerners' control of the Southern Gateway, north of the First Cataract. The fact that the indigenous Africans of the Nile Valley were just one common stock of people who at various periods in their history found it necessary to wage war against each other for economic and geopolitical gains may be observed in the inscription on the fragmented stone taken from Jebelian temple of Pharaoh Mentuhotep II of the 11th dynasty. This pharaoh is depicted in a position suggestive of smiting 4 armies. These 4 enemies represented the 4 physical types common to the area of the lower Nile Valley during the 11th dynasty: Egyptians, Nubians, Ethiopians, and foreigners who came from Asia and Europe only for education and visits up to this period. One would note that the later 2 foreigners, European and European American authorities, have labeled white and black Semites, Hamites, also black and white Caucasians. Pharaoh Mentuhotep, the second successor, Pharaoh Mentuhotep III of the same dynasty, 2060 through 2010 BCE, is also recorded on another rock inscription with respect to his own expedition when he crossed the Nile River near the First Cataract with ships to Watwat. The interaction between the North Tamari and South Tahanisi, sometimes including Meroe and Ethiopia, had become so intense that Pharaoh Mentuhotep III was forced to restore the military office and title of Keeper of the Door of the South, a title still symbolically used in modern Masonic orders by the office of the Junior Warden, who is the protector of the southern door or columns. These areas of intercourse between Northerners and Southerners are so glaringly clear in the inscriptions left by the indigenous Africans of the Nile Valley high cultures that even the so-called Semitic school of white liberal Africans of almost every type of discipline have concluded that the princely family of Amenemhat, the vizier of Pharaoh Mentuhotep III, 2060 through 2010 BC, had Nubian blood in his veins. The above extract is taken from the article by H. Junker, The First Appearance of the Negroes in History, Journal of the Egyptian Archaeology, and one by H. E. Wentlock, Neb-Hetep Re-Mentu Hotep of the 11th Dynasty, Journal of Egyptian Archaeology. This type of racist interpretation came by way of the willful distortion and plagiarization of the inscriptions taken from the Egyptian documents in a collection called the Petrograd Papyrus. Like all of the other records removed from Taha Mary, not a single indigenous African to whom such documents belong authorized their removal from Akubalan. The issue of Nubian, Negro blood in his veins is the basic reason why so many European and European American educators cannot honestly interpret, write, or teach any aspect of Africa's history and high culture, the Nile Valley in particular, to the satisfaction of any respecting black woman, man, or child anywhere who is aware of his or her glorious African heritage. By what type of remote genealogical method of conception did Pharaoh Amenemhat of the 12th dynasty, 2000 through 1785 BCE, receive Nubian Negro blood in his veins, and not Pharaoh Aha or Narmer, Min or Mina of the 1st dynasty, 2780 through 2680 BCE? Pharaoh Akhenaten of the 13th dynasty, 1785, architect and god of medicine Imhotep of the 3rd dynasty for Pharaoh Djoser, or even the statue of Isis and the infant Horus, Black Madonna and Child, and religiously bigoted anti-Negro, anti-Black process in which Africa's history, North and East especially, is being taught and written by European American educators who continue spewing white Christian racial purity and Judaic purity and white Semitism in the form of the God's chosen people propaganda. All of this is consistent with their membership in the superior great white race. Professor Breasted, Dr. Janai, Professor Groves, and others, under the disguise of white liberal Africanists, have assured them equally apply to the Semitic Egyptians. Such teachings find these educators following the others that preceded them in what they have commonly described as academic scholarship and discipline. The indigenous Africans and their descendants, of course, being unable to receive or deal with such godly inspiration and recognition of their own history and high cultures. How could it have been possible for any indigenous group of the Nile Valley African people to have remained pure anything, white Caucasian, Hamite, Semite, or Caucasoid particularly, if that they were, and did not become totally whatever else their neighbors at their intermediate south, Tahanesians, Morose, Ethiopians were, particularly when there were no physical or mental barriers between them, plus the fact that many of their armies overran each other's homeland and constantly raped each other's women. It could only happen in the textbooks and other academic scholarship works of Europe, American, European, and British Africanists of liberal and orthodox vintage. Unfortunately, very little of this type of racist propaganda and religious bigotry is being challenged in Black or African study courses, as too many of said departments depend upon the same people who are preaching such cultural genocide for all forms of grants and scholarships, not to mention annual budgets. One must certainly feel totally frustrated about the entire basis upon which this aspect of Akubalan's history has been presented so far to students in African and Black studies courses by so-called white liberal Africanists, but mostly by Black professors who know different and still ape said authorities on Africa and African people everywhere. For one too often finds that even W.M. Flanders Petrie, the father of archaeology and one of the first of the Egyptologists, some years ago claimed that there are definite connections between ancient Egypt and southern Russia, more particularly with the Caucasus.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be